Good morning. I'm Gary Chartier from La Sierra University School of Business and the Center for a Stateless Society. And I'm very pleased to be here this morning with you as part of the groundbreaking Agora.io conference. It's a real pleasure to be here with you and with George Donnelly and all the others from C4SS and elsewhere who are actively involved in making this event happen. It's really an honor, and it's really a pleasure, and I think we're going to have a good time. And I want to spend some time with you today talking about the question of personal style in anarchist activism. So I think we all know instinctively why this is a problem, why it's an issue, why we need to discuss it. And the reason is this. People who become involved in writing and speaking and acting on behalf of anarchism are people who are passionate about ideas. People who care about ideas are people who, in the nature of the case, think ideas matter. People who believe that ideas will transform individual relationships and social institutions. They're confident that if you share an idea and you do so convincingly, the world will change. Things will be different. And no doubt there's something right about that. I certainly believe with the great mid-20th century conservative thinker Richard Weaver that ideas have consequences. No argument about that at all. But I also think it's important to recognize that not everybody is fundamentally idea-driven. And indeed, it's probably worth recognizing we're not probably as idea-driven as we suppose. The reality is that our ideas sometimes drive our actions, but sometimes they summarize and synthesize deep-seated convictions that have their roots at a place much farther down inside our guts. And our sense, certainly, that being pushed around and ordered around and violated by aggression is a horrible thing and to be resisted. That's something that certainly can be understood as justified by clear and responsible thinking, and I'm prepared to go to the mat to defend it. But I also recognize, speaking for myself, that there's some deep gut-level psychological stuff going on here that really is pretty foundational. So even, I think, for a professional intellectual who's as much of an egghead as most people are likely to be, ideas aren't the only thing that matters. But I think when we find ourselves engaging with people in a variety of settings in which we might try to sell anarchism to them, we have to recognize how diverse are their motivations and how important it is to be aware of ourselves and the role our own personal styles and personal identities play in the equation. Marshall McLuhan famously said, "The medium is the message." He went on to talk about the medium is the mass age and the medium is the massage and lots of other things. But he started out by observing that the medium is the message. And I think that point is nowhere more obvious or more true than in this area of anarchist activism. When you and I bring ourselves to the table, we bring our full-orbed, three-dimensional personae to the table. It's not just the case that we bring our ideas in abstraction from who we are. And that's why I think the notion of personal style is so important. We've got to think about communicating on behalf of anarchism as an exercise in sales. Anarchism is a product. Okay? Now, anarchist activism doesn't just involve sales, obviously. If you're engaged, as many people who would participate in a conference like Agora.io are engaged in shaping alternate institutions, in operating outside the state's radar, perhaps in doing a range of things that are designed to undermine the state's authority and legitimacy, then perhaps what you're doing isn't accurately described as sales. But I think most of the time, when we're trying to change minds directly, at least some aspect of what we're doing can reasonably be described as a matter of sales. And I think it's perhaps easiest to sum up what I'm getting at when I talk about this sales task to say what we need to do is to remember that peace and freedom begin with us, and they begin in our own hearts. Now, I understand that can sound cheesy and perhaps like a summer camp song from the 1970s with a guitar in the background, but I really believe that there's something crucial about this. And I guess what I want to say is that it is very difficult to free other people when you're not free yourself. It is difficult to help other people find peace when you're not at peace yourself. And how do you know that you're not at peace yourself? How do you know you're not free yourself? The answer, I think, is pretty straightforward. You know because you are constantly reacting from a place of fear and anger. And when you do that, what happens? You find yourself attacking, you find yourself criticizing, you find yourself trying to shore up your own insecurities by undermining others and explaining what's wrong with them. There's a famous cartoon that I suspect a lot of people involved in this conference have seen. And I'll paraphrase the text, but it shows a guy sitting at his computer, bowed over the keyboard, and someone, presumably his partner, is calling from off frame. Hey, it's after 11 o'clock. It's time to come to bed. And he calls back, I can't. There are people out there on the internet who are wrong, and I still haven't corrected them. So I think that's a mentality that, unfortunately, we can often find pervasive. It can be compulsive for us to identify and attack and undermine the errors of all those people out there. And I think it's clear that when we do this, we're coming from a place of pretty deep-seated insecurity. I mean, obviously, sometimes it may well be strategically useful, maybe educationally, pedagogically helpful to point out to people where there are flaws in their arguments. But when I instead feel that I have little choice but to engage in an endless, angry back and forth with somebody whose mind doesn't seem to be changing and who is really just reacting very negatively to my approach, then I think that's evidence that I'm behaving in a not very constructive way. And I've talked about this in the context of the internet because I think so much communication, so much networking, so much community building among anarchists today is happening online. But clearly the same is true when we're talking about engaging with people in the real world. There is nothing less appealing than a self-righteous zealot. While I've said, and I firmly believe, that the personal is political, that you bring yourself to the table in all three dimensions when you engage with others about anarchy or about anything else, there is nothing less appealing than somebody whose sense of the personal as the political is simply to demand the force-fitting of every aspect of life into some prepackaged political box, and who insists that everybody meet some predetermined standard of political correctness with respect to any and all aspects of his or her life. Political zealotry is not attractive. Political self-righteousness is deeply off-putting. Okay, so it is very easy to get caught up in unloading your own emotional baggage and to become a kind of zealous, self-righteous crusader. And really, ironically, this turns you into the mirror image of the statist. When you complain about statist authoritarianism and statist domination of people's lives, and then you seek, in turn, to browbeat them into submission, you're really functioning in very much the same way. Okay, so what you need to think about then is how structures of authority and domination are replicated in the ordinary relationships that you're part of, certainly in family and religious congregation and school and so forth, but also in your own mind, in your own heart, in your own psyche. You know, are past authority figures, I think it's worth asking, still running your life from inside your head? And you may say, well, no, I've rejected the absurd superstitions that I got from this or that past authority figure, and that's great. But if you're still engaged in reaction against that authority figure, if you're still fighting battles with an obnoxious high school teacher or a priest or rabbi, then while in one sense you may be liberated from bad ideas, at some deeper level, the compulsions involved in dealing with that past authoritarianism are still with you. If you're still engaged in angry, repressed, violent conflict with people who aren't really present, you know, then it's certainly worth asking how much importance, irrational fear and guilt play in your life. So I think you need to go to work, so there I fall into the trap again. I can't tell you what to do. I can't demand that you do any of this. I'm offering advice. Okay, and the advice is not the advice of an authority figure. It's the advice of somebody who's struggling with these issues on an ongoing basis in the real world. When I stop and take a look at myself, I can certainly see these dynamics continue to play out. So, but I think it makes sense to go to work on these questions with yourself, with most importantly, I think people you trust, with friends you trust, certainly in principle with a therapist or somebody you regard as a spiritual guide. But, the most important thing is that you have to feel safe. There's no point doing any of this if you don't feel safe. Make sure that you are ready to offer other people genuine freedom before you attempt to do so purely on the ideological level. Make sure that existentially, emotionally, you're ready to do that. Because if you don't, you really run the risk of poisoning the well. Much as I'd like to suggest otherwise, there aren't all that many anarchists in the world. And people's experience of what an anarchist is like is going to depend in large part on their experience of the relatively few anarchists they know. Okay? And some of those anarchists are going to be people who will excite them and enliven them, and some of those anarchists are going to be people who will turn them off in a quite serious way. So make sure that if you want to have an impact, you're not one of those people who turns other people off. Now, it's perfectly fine for you to say, look, I'm interested first and foremost in expressing my own convictions. I want to be true to myself. And when I'm outraged by something, I want to express that outrage. And when people irritate and frustrate me, I don't want to deal with that. I either want them to change their minds or be quiet and leave me alone. Okay, and that's fine. If that's the position you want to take, then just be clear that that's the position you want to take. But if your goal is to educate and to move and to transform, then I think it's going to be far more constructive to make sure that you're not moved and driven by anger. Okay? So the reality is that people are going to be attracted to your cause, and at the same time you're going to find energy and inspiration to work for that cause. if your commitment to a free society reflects genuine love for other people and for yourself, okay, you can certainly act out of anger and frustration, and by George, there's a lot to be angry about. Okay? I mean, I think every day I read about exercises in petty tyranny and in horrible large-scale violence. And I don't want for a second to pretend that these things aren't terrible. I don't want to pretend for a second they're not awful, they're not worth being sad about and angry about and scared in response to. Okay? They're terrifying. They're horrible. And it's often very unclear what to do about them. Everything from, the large-scale awfulness of planes raining down bombs in the Middle East to, the terrible oppression of a guy like Bernard von Nothaus being convicted for counterfeiting, for doing nothing fraudulent, nothing dishonest. It's a terrible time to be in, and we do have things that understandably provoke our anger and our resentment. But if at root our activism emerges from that anger, if that's the primary driving force from which we act, then we're going to find it difficult not to be bitter, unpleasant people who are consumed by our own rage. If instead we find that what we do can emerge from love, if it can emerge from love for ourselves, love for other people, those we want to help, including ourselves and our loved ones and those with whom we're trying to communicate, if love is the motivating factor, not a sense of lack and deficiency and a desire to control, but an outflowing delight in and concern for the other, not a kind of if you will, charity in the bad sense, but overflowing benevolence, if that can motivate us, then we're not going to be captivated by anger. We're not going to be captivated by a destructive sense of ourselves as agents of vengeance or self-righteousness. If you want to avoid engaging in destructive behavior, destructive of others, destructive of yourself, then find that place of love that can really move you. You'll have more energy. I mean, over the short term, anger can be a powerful motivator, but over the long term, anger is not going to survive as an effective way of moving yourself. Okay? So I think that's really, really crucial. We need to find the ability to be moved by love. So if you then think about the foundation of an effective personal style in anarchist activism as one in which you move beyond resentment, one in which you embrace love as a motive rather than hatred, rather than anger, then the question is, what next? And I suggest that what matters here is that we begin by building genuinely liberating relationships with the people in our lives. Now, let's begin with the inescapable recognition that most of the people in your life are not likely to be anarchists. If being an anarchist means somebody who is actively engaged in trying to do something to support the emergence of a society rooted in peaceful, voluntary cooperation, that's the only kind of anarchist worth being. If that's what you mean by an anarchist, then at no point is that going to be a majority opinion. Even if we have anarchy, most people are not going to be focally concerned with building and maintaining social institutions. Most people go about the business of their lives, doing what they do. And that's going to be as true in the future as it is now. But certainly right now, people aren't even going to be at some minimal level convinced of the rightness of anarchist ideas, much less engaged in trying to promote them. So many of the people you know may never take anarchism seriously. And here's the important thing to recognize. That's okay. Okay? That's okay. You have not failed. The universe is not going to collapse. Your identity as an anarchist, the merit of your convictions, not called into question. None of those things is called into question just because the people you know turn out not to be anarchists. It's not your job to turn anybody into a clone of yourself. And the success of your efforts to build a stateless society doesn't depend on everybody's coming to share your views. Okay, your friendships certainly don't need to be political. Okay, I mean, if they are, that's great, but they don't need to be political. The last thing we need is a kind of grim review of personal relationships for ideological correctness. I mean, this is something that has marked lots of political movements. It's typical of small Marxist cells, as also of certain kinds of fundamentalist religions. You don't want that. Nobody wants to be part of that. There may be some short-term benefit to it, but it is ultimately destructive of human ties and human decency and the richness of human life. Okay? So to the extent that you find yourself doing that, the extent that you find yourself reviewing your relationships for their ideological correctness, recognize that what you're doing is saying, in effect, that your ideology matters more than real people. Okay? So obviously the point of the ideology, if it's a good ideology, is to make human lives better. But the pursuit of that ideology can never be a substitute for real human contact, real human relationships, for ordinary life in the world. The point of anarchism is to make ordinary life in the world better, not to turn everybody into some kind of humorless activist. Okay? So anarchism is about living a good life, and friendship is a marvelous aspect of human welfare. It is a good thing to have flourishing friendships, whether your friends agree with you about anything at all. And you pervert friendship if you turn it into an opportunity for proselytizing. Okay? I think we all understand how unpleasant that can be when people seek to force alien religious convictions on us. Clearly the same thing is true in the realm of politics. And of course, nothing stops you from working on particular campaigns with friends who may disagree with you significantly about many or most issues, right? So, I mean, a friendship can certainly be political in some narrow sense. You may have a friend who is deeply committed, let's say, for instance, to anti-war activism, and who's happy to agree with you as an anarchist about the evil of war and the national security state, but who may completely miss the problems with the kind of state-corporate alliance that I think so many anarchists rightly want to highlight. Okay, who may think that corporatism is just fine. Okay, you know, it's not an all-or-nothing matter. So I think it's right to say that friendships don't have to be fundamentally political, but if there can be some political cooperation, great. Just recognize that it can be issue by issue. It doesn't have to be a kind of uniform 100% all or nothing sort of thing. So that's fine. The thing to recognize is that your friendships matter whether they're political or not. The most important way to get people excited about the possibility of liberation, that's really what we're talking about here, right? We're talking about building a free society. The most important way to get people excited about the possibility of liberation is to connect with them personally. And doing that is a lot more useful, a lot more effective than posting a YouTube video of yourself presenting a PowerPoint presentation. Okay, now you want to do that, that's fine. I'm not telling you not to do that. I'm not saying that can never be useful. I'm not saying you can't stimulate thinking and make people aware of important issues, but being a friend, a genuine friend, not a friend for the sake of turning somebody into an anarchist, but a friend because you value friendship and you value the other person. That's what really matters. Building genuine human bonds with people enables them to understand your concerns and your objectives from the inside. They really see why you do what you do and who you are. It helps them to see why those convictions might be attractive. Okay? If you want to engage with people politically, whatever you do, don't lecture them from a position of authority. Talk to them instead in a very personal way about your problems and your frustrations, your experiences of moral outrage at state abuses, your fears about state authority, your discoveries of alternatives to state-based ways of doing things. Talk about your own experience. Make it personal, okay? If you're writing a book, then of course the book may include a personal dimension. It may be more abstract. But if you're engaging one-on-one with somebody, don't forget that you bring your own experiences to the table and you bring your own personal identity with you, and your activism, we know, from introspection, from reflection, our own activism is rooted in who we are. So be upfront about that. Talk about how who you are, what you're doing, affects who you are, and bring that personal self-awareness to the table when you share your convictions with others. So, the reality is that people are more loyal to their friends than they are to movements or ideas. Okay? Remember that. People are more loyal to their friends than they ever are to movements or ideas. People will do things to support their friends they are less likely to do to support abstract ideologies. People who aren't sure about the ideologies at all may nonetheless show up to support their friends. I think we all know that. Share the possibility of freedom with your friends, undogmatically and generously, and you will make the cause of anarchism immeasurably stronger. So those one-on-one relationships, I think, come to be places where personal style is absolutely crucial. It's also worth noting, of course, that personal style is born very often in both those one-on-one relationships, but also in other small-scale relationships. And if you're concerned about personal style, then it's certainly worth asking about what happens in the small-scale institutions of our lives. Authoritarianism begins at home. When children are old enough to understand arguments, but parents still insist on obedience just because they're parents, because children live in their homes, they reinforce the message that deference to parental authority, to positional authority, is a basic and inescapable part of life. Obey me because I occupy this position, whether I'm right or not. Now, parents who treat their children in demeaning ways or who use physical force against them when they'd never do so against adults send the message that people in authority answer to different rules than others do, and that aggressive or punitive violence is an acceptable way to solve problems. Okay? People don't become bullies out of nowhere. People don't become deferential to authoritarianism out of nowhere. That kind of personal style, that kind of personal attitude emerges in the real-world interactions that they have. And, it's worth noticing this and trying to address it in our own lives as soon as we can. If the kind of personality that gives birth to the state is nourished in authoritarian, brutal home environments, then if you care about making the world state-free, it is worth taking a look at what goes on in your own home. Okay, and in some extreme cases, even perhaps those of others. I certainly don't want to encourage awful meddling, but obviously, if you see brutal violence against the defenseless, it's worth asking if there's anything you can do about it. And the same problems, obviously, that we see in homes, the same kind of small-scale interactions that give birth to problematic personal styles. I mean, this also is evident in schools and religious congregations. Rigid learning formats, required deference to teachers' personal authority, violently enforced attendance rules, all stifle individuality, all breed an attitude marked simultaneously by acceptance of authority and the resentful desire to escape its sting by becoming able to exercise it over others. That's what happens in any setting. When people are beaten down by authority, when people are pushed around by bullies, the tendency is to want to be a big enough bully oneself to avoid the bullying of others. It becomes very easy It doesn't have to. This isn't a logical relationship, but it becomes very easy to seek to move beyond bullying by becoming a bully. And this is just one of those places in which authoritarianism emerges. Okay? So, similarly, this is, it's not just schools. It's very important to think about how schools in your community might be organized and about alternatives. The more I read about the day-to-day horrors that schools subject kids to, the more I'm convinced that as long as schools function the way they do now, there's no way that homeschooling isn't a preferable alternative for a great many kids. But various kinds of community schools, community-based schools that move outside the public school ambit might be able to play that role as well. So religious congregations obviously can be seedbeds of authoritarianism as well. Clerics who act as if they have special access to revealed truth, who imply that they lack the failings they see in members of their congregations, who generate false guilt for disregarding their authority or engaging in taboo violations that really don't harm anybody, all contribute to the creation of a mindset of resentful servility, resentful submission to authority. And many clerics proclaim the importance of acknowledging the legitimacy of other authority figures, including parents, women's male life partners, and state officials. Just watch the patriotic displays on state-proclaimed holidays, and you will see how enthusiastically religious leaders can get involved in promoting authority. But if you think about these kinds of small-scale interactions and the ways in which they can give birth to problematic personal styles, again, I think it's really crucial to nip these problems in the bud where you can. And if you want to think about how to avoid becoming an authoritarian yourself, how to reach people effectively, and how to help others move beyond that kind of authoritarian mindset, that's really crucial. So here's the bottom line. Who you are matters enormously. Your fundamental gift to the freedom movement is yourself. Your fundamental gift to the freedom movement is yourself. When you are free and peaceful and loving on a personal level, you can make a profoundly powerful contribution to liberating others and to freeing our world. Thanks very much. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm perfectly happy, I have a few more minutes here, and I'm perfectly happy to take questions. So I have not used the IM function here, and so I don't know for certain whether I should have volunteered to do that. I can click chat. That's right. So I've just clicked chat, and so if you've got any questions between now and when my time is up, I'm certainly glad to entertain them. So I'm in the chat room, and I don't, in fact, notice anybody chatting. So apparently there are, at least if I'm reading this correctly, 60 views of this presentation. I'm really glad everybody's here. And if you want to pursue these issues further, and you don't feel like contributing to a public chat at this point, let me suggest that another option certainly is to email me at gary.chartier, gary.chartier @gmail.com, and I'm certainly happy to pursue these with you further, as also on Facebook if that's helpful. I do think these issues are really important and well worth talking about. So let me just give a couple more minutes here and see if anybody does want to enter the chat room conversation, and if so, I'll be very happy to respond on online so that everybody can hear that. Okay, so somebody says, okay, the Agora.io site has a different chat window. Okay, well, so that's great. Now the question is, thanks, Jim. I appreciate your letting me know that. Let me see if I can locate that chat window. Perhaps people are chatting as we speak, and if that's the case, I apologize for ignoring that. Okay, so we can indeed chat here at this site. Okay, great. Okay, so I'm pausing this and nonetheless getting sound. Okay, great. Okay, great. So here we do have some chat going on, and so I very much appreciate the fact. Okay, great. So we have several participants in the chat, so I'm glad to talk about that. So I can't resist saying yes. Okay, can't resist saying yes to Brad and others who have emphasized the importance, yes, of plugging my book, The Conscience of an Anarchist. That's a book that I drew on freely here today, though there's certainly material in what I said today that you won't find in Conscience. Conscience of an Anarchist is available from Cobden Press at freeminds.org. And that's fr33minds.org, and you can obtain it there online. fr33minds.org. Conscience of an Anarchist is a book in which I try to talk about a range of things. I certainly talk about these issues of personal style, but also about the fundamental kind of intellectual underpinnings of state authority and some of the key reasons, the deep destructiveness of war, the awfulness of economic privilege, and the real problems that result when the state attacks personal freedom that make the state dangerous and worth moving beyond. So I'm not averse to self-promotion, and I appreciate the nudge from a couple different commenters in the chat room about that. But are there any other observations that anybody might want to make about the topic here? Okay, so. A couple of questions here. Let me try to think about those with you. So one person says, so Corey Moore says, as time goes on, this will get easier, I hope. And I think that's, maybe that's a comment about using Justin TV, but I presume it's a comment about sharing convictions with other people. And I do think that's exactly right. I think that as we become more confident, as we become more aware of the issues, as we become more aware of our roots in a network of people who can support us, then I think that does make things tremendously easier. When you feel like you're alone, when you're standing all by yourself, your capacity to communicate effectively with others certainly is going to be challenged in one way or another by a sense of isolation. And I think it matters a great deal that we be aware of those connections. I really like Sheldon Richman's metaphor of molecular individualism. A lot of people criticize those who are individualist anarchists as committed to atomistic individualism, where the idea is that we all believe we're somehow isolated individuals off in some kind of la-la land in which we don't need each other and we don't interact with each other and we don't depend on each other. And the reality is, I think Sheldon's right, we're molecular individuals. We are real, particular persons who are not subservient to anybody else and who aren't somehow absorbed into anybody else's identity, and yet at the same time we're nonetheless part of real relationships with each other that sustain and empower us, and that we enrich and from which we can be enriched. Okay? Absolutely think that's right. Now, so Dan Gould says, I think business relationships are key. And what's your opinion? So, I guess my view is that for people who are involved in the business world, certainly there's a great opportunity there to show people who really see the value of free cooperation, of peaceful voluntary cooperation, both in markets in the narrow sense, the commercial sense, and then also markets in the broad sense of just the whole sphere of voluntary interaction. There's a great opportunity that that business interaction can provide there for showing people that, hey, we see in the business world that it is possible to cooperate without the heavy hand of the state, without Leviathan looking down on us. I think that's absolutely right. Now, look, we need to recognize that different business relationships will have different flavors, and there are clearly lots of business people who've gotten very accustomed to using state power to manipulate markets and to secure profits to themselves. And that's just a reminder that not everyone benefits equally from the elimination of the state, right? And so while I think business relationships provide great launching platforms for conversations about the value of markets, at the same time, you just have to recognize some people have blind spots, and some people really think they benefit from the state, and you have to be aware of that when you communicate with them. If you've read about the early history of the 20th century post-World War II market-oriented libertarian movement in the United States, you find, for instance, one of the great funders of some libertarian causes was a South Carolina magnate named Roger Millikan. Roger Millikan, at the same time, was an enthusiastic proponent of trade barriers, of tariffs that benefited his industry. I believe he was in the textile industry. So, you just recognize business relationships can be great platforms for conversations about freedom, and yet there are obviously challenges you have to be aware of there. So lots of cool observations here. So Nick Saursa says, I really like the word anarchist. How do you defend your use of the word to other anarcho-types that feel the word to equate to violence? Well, so I guess I go out of my way when I talk about anarchism to say that anarchism is about peaceful, voluntary cooperation. That what I am rejecting as an anarchist is precisely aggressive violence, both the centralized aggressive violence of the state, which is the worst kind, and certainly the most destructive kind, but also clearly the small-scale aggressive violence of everybody from mafia thugs to brutal partners. I mean, all I can do to resist that negative association that I think the word anarchy often has is to keep emphasizing that my vision of anarchy is fundamentally a vision of peaceful voluntary cooperation. And I understand that there are people who hear anarchy as something else entirely, but I think that actually presents an opportunity for us, because the kind of flavor that they associate with anarchy is a flavor of just utter craziness. And they think, well, why would anybody say I'm an anarchist if anarchy means chaotic violence? And so their ears are going to be open to a conversation about why anybody would use the word at all. It's not as if anarchy is a little off the radar for them. It's way off the radar. And the thought that anybody might identify as an anarchist at all is something, it seems to me, that's going to be a source of craziness for them, and they're going to find it difficult to process, and precisely because they are, if you can get them to listen at all, they're going to be more attentive, because they'll be trying to make sense of what seems to them to be a real conflict between good sense on the one hand and the way you're talking on the other. And that gives you a great opportunity to say, no, I understand why you think it would be crazy to be an anarchist, given what you think anarchy's about, but let me tell you what I mean. Okay. Okay, let me just see what else. So, Frederick Polgardy says, hyper-individualism, and if I butcher your name, I apologize. Hyper-individualism and hyper-socialism both miss the mark on this. Absolutely. So, there's a great, I guess, Saturday Evening Post cover that my friend Charles Thiel is very fond of. He's described it. I've never seen it, and he hasn't seen it for years, so I'm going to just reproduce what he talks about. But it called to his attention a contrast among three ways of thinking about people. So on the one hand, there's the egg carton. We've got a bunch of eggs in neatly ordered rows, separated by the material of the egg carton, not touching each other, all looking in the same direction. Then you've got eggnog. All the eggs are whipped together into an amorphous, individual-free mass. And we can see these as reflective of hyper-individualism and hyper-collectivism, of atomistic individualism on the one hand and collectivism on the other. And then he suggests, by contrast, from the Saturday Evening Post cover, there's the egg basket with the eggs in all kinds of different angles and doing different things, but all in this basket in contact with each other. And I think that captures nicely as an image the difference between the hyper-individualism and hyper-collectivism on the one hand, and the molecular individualism, I think, that Sheldon rightly emphasizes. Okay. So let's see what else. Lots of different questions here. Kevin Geese says, what's the best method to use to calm down an over-aggressive cop without getting your head bashed in? And then Kevin adds, non-lethal weapons like tasers are now being used as compliance tools for the state to compel the sheeple. So I thought I would raise the question. So I think that's really a sensible and very practical question. And I can tell you from my own experience that when an authority figure, like a cop, wants to stare me down and bully me, my own instinctive response is to want to engage in violence. Okay? I'd like to imagine myself as a 6'6", 300-pound guy with 2 black belts who can take out this bully who is making me feel small and scared. Okay? That's just a visceral reaction on my part. I recognize, for a whole host of reasons, that that's not the way to go. And the reality is, it's not what I want to hear when I'm in a situation like that, but my sense is that when the cop is staring me down, and the cop has moved past the point where this is a typically male thing. Obviously, we know that there are female cops, but it's the male cops who are pushing my emotional buttons. When the cops move past the point at which he is listening to a conversation and he's just barking orders and just wants me to shut up, then I think the reality is that unless you're an extremely skilled psychologically adept negotiator, the best thing you can do, honestly, to de-escalate the situation is to be as cooperative as possible. It's not what I want to do in a situation like that. When I'm under somebody's thumb, I feel angry and violent, and I really want to respond in a very negative way. I don't think that in the vast majority of cases, most people are going to be able to defuse the situation in any way other than simply, de-escalating by being as non-confrontational as possible. I'm not arguing that that's the right path for everybody. There may well be people in this chat who are much more socially adept than I am, and who can easily see a way of moving past that cop's defenses. And if you've got a witty observation, that's great. On Facebook the other day, I saw the following, no doubt apocryphal story, but I have to pass it on because it amused me. The story involves a woman who's speeding. A cop stops her. The cop's walking toward her car. They're in Illinois. She says to the cop when he comes to her now rolled down window, "Oh, so I bet you're here to sell me tickets to the Illinois State Troopers ball." And the cop looks puzzled, and he says, "No, Illinois State Troopers don't have balls." And then he stops, thinks a little more about that, and walks away. If you can be clever enough to do that, good for you. I'm not arguing against that at all. But I think when I read Kevin's question, I want the people who are listening to this chat, to this conversation, who are participating in the chat, to be safe. And I recognize that very often the safe thing to do may be simply to cooperate and close your mouth. Okay. Another question from Kevin. Kevin says, Gary, agent provocateur that break windows are promoted by the mainstream media as being anarchist. Evidence that corporatized MSMs doublespeak, twist the language to shame free people to not standing up for one's own peaceful voluntary cooperation. I like the PVC acronym. So, yeah, I think there's something absolutely right about that. When you want to argue for anarchism, you start out confronting the fact that what you get in the mainstream media are these images of what my friend Kevin Carson summarizes as, masked kids in Circle A T-shirts smashing windows. If that's what you see, if that's what you're envisioning, then when somebody says, I'm an anarchist, that's a source of craziness. People certainly see that and think, why would I want to have anything to do with that? And so the mainstream media certainly create this opportunity even as they create a problem. So they create the problem, obviously, by making it seem that being an anarchist is just being an agent of chaos and destructive violence, but at the same time, because it seems so odd that calm, nice, generous person across the aisle from you could actually be interested in chaos and violence. When that person says, I'm an anarchist, your ears are going to perk up. And so I think at that point the anarchist does have a great opportunity. Okay, let's see what else is going on here. Okay. So lots of other observations here. So Dan Gould says, when an individual can live happily without ever using a Federal Reserve note, then he or she will be truly free from a political point of view. And I think what we've got to recognize is that absolutely, if you can simply opt out completely of the American states or any other state's reach, that's a great place to be. We also recognize that that's not an opportunity that everybody has, right? That the costs may be, from an individual's perspective, just too great to warrant that kind of opting out at this point. Obviously, our goal as anarchists is to create social institutions in which the cost of opting out of the state's authority, those costs are zero because there's no state, and on the way to that point, the costs are really minimal because there are so many flourishing non-state institutions in which people can participate. We recognize, I think, that that's not where we are right now. And so I think that's clearly a point against which we can measure our own success in achieving political liberation. What I wanted to suggest in this talk was that if we're going to engage in activism that involves affecting how other people see things, then the first task that we face is to figure out how we're going to free our own minds and to allow that freedom to be evident in the way we interact with other people. Before we ever get to the point at which we're free from the state's grasp, if we're going to free ourselves from that grasp and free other people from that grasp, we've got to be at a point at which we are able to impart freedom to others at the psychological level rather than turning our activism into an opportunity for authoritarianism and paternalism and abuse. Yes, and Frederick, I agree absolutely. Frederick says, anarchy is not the daughter, but the mother of order. Absolutely. It starts with freedom. Real, enduring, stable order that takes full account of the realities at the grassroots starts from the grassroots. It's not imposed from the top down, and Proudhon was absolutely right when he said that. So Nick Ford says, what liberals say that, or does it mean the UK meaning of liberals? And I guess I'm not Oh, sorry. Liberals say taxation is theft. Print your own personal currency. You can keep it all to yourself. The cash is our cash. This is a tweet that a Guardian journalist sent yesterday. Yes, so clearly what the Guardian journalist has in mind there is classical liberalism. But of course, the Guardian journalist is just wrong. If people start printing their own currency and using that currency for their own transactions, we've seen what happened to Bernard von Nothaus. Now, the statute in question there focused on coins. Perhaps there are ways in which the legal system could have, in which legal pre-planning could have reduced von Nothaus's risks. But the fact is that when the journalist says, "Well, if you guys have your own currency, we'll ignore you," I think that's just false. The state isn't going to ignore people who opt out of its grasp. I think that's right. Okay, so my clock says that it's 10:55 Eastern Time, and I know it's important for the next speaker to get set up. So thank you very much to everybody who's participated in the chat and who checked in to the lecture. I think George and the others involved in making Agora.io happen deserve enormous credit, and I thank them for their passion for a free society.